It was a bright, peaceful morning, and Maria Johnson was ready to run some errands. She was a woman of elegance and grace, dressed in a crisp white blouse and navy blue slacks. Her day's plan was simple: pick up a few things from the shopping mall and return home. Maria was no ordinary woman. She was married to Commissioner James Johnson, one of the most respected and fair police leaders in the city. But today, she didn't think much about her husband's position. She was just Maria, a woman on her usual errands. Maria parked her car in the bustling mall parking lot and walked confidently toward the entrance. The security team at the mall scanned cars and people as they passed, doing their routine checks. Maria gave them a polite nod as she walked inside, thinking nothing of it. Inside the mall, she strolled through aisles, picking up items for her home, smiling at strangers, and enjoying her morning. She had no idea that, outside, something was brewing. A mix-up had occurred at the security checkpoint. A vehicle resembling Maria's had been flagged earlier in connection with a minor theft case. The mall security, noticing her car, called the local police, reporting what they believed to be suspicious. It was a simple misunderstanding, but one that was about to spiral out of control. Maria exited the mall about an hour later, carrying a few shopping bags. The parking lot was still busy, filled with the sound of cars starting and people chatting. She approached her car, placing her bags in the trunk. Just as she closed it, she heard a voice behind her. "Excuse me, Mom," a man said firmly. Maria turned to see two police officers walking toward her. Their uniforms were neat, and their expressions were serious. Maria smiled politely, assuming it was just a routine matter. "Yes, officers?" she asked, her voice calm. "We received a report about this vehicle matching the description of one involved in an incident," one officer, whose name tag read Taylor, said. "We'll need to search it." Maria blinked in surprise. "There must be a mistake," she replied. "This is my car, and I'd only been shopping." Officer Taylor's expression didn't soften. "We still need to check. Step aside, please." Maria stepped back, though confusion began to creep in. She watched as the officers opened her car doors and began searching through her belongings. They pulled out her shopping bags, her purse, and even looked under the seats. "Is this really necessary?" Maria asked politely. "I've done nothing wrong." The second officer, whose name was Grant, gave her a dismissive glance. "We're just doing our job, Mom." Maria's patience was wearing thin, but she remained composed. "I understand that, but this feels excessive." Taylor smirked slightly. "If you've got nothing to hide, there's no problem, right?" A small crowd of bystanders began to gather, curious about the scene. Some whispered among themselves, wondering why the well-dressed woman was being treated like a suspect. A few even pulled out their phones to record the incident. Maria took a deep breath. She was not a confrontational person, but she also wasn't someone who let herself be pushed around unfairly. "Officers," she said firmly, "this is my car, and I've done nothing wrong. My husband is Commissioner James Johnson. If there's an issue, perhaps you should call them." The mention of her husband's name didn't seem to faze the officers. Taylor scoffed. "Commissioner's wife, huh? That's a new one. Nice try." Maria's heart sank, not because she feared what they might do, but because of the sheer arrogance in their tone. She pulled out her phone, dialing James's number. Her husband picked up almost immediately. "James," Maria said calmly, though her voice had an edge. "I'm at the mall parking lot, and two officers are searching my car without cause. Can you come here, please?" James's tone was sharp and serious. "Stay where you are. I'm on my way." Maria hung up, her posture straight and unwavering. The officers continued their unnecessary search, unaware of who they were dealing with. The crowd grew, and whispers turned to murmurs. Maria remained calm, though inside, she was frustrated. She knew James would handle this, but the officers were about to realize the mistake they had made. And for them, it was a mistake they would not forget. Maria stood calmly beside her car, her phone still in her hand. Though her posture was composed, she felt a growing sense of frustration. She had done nothing wrong, yet these officers treated her with suspicion and disregard. The two officers, Taylor and Grant, continued their search, rifling through her belongings without her consent. Their dismissive attitude grated on her, but Maria refused to lose her dignity. The small crowd of onlookers grew larger, people whispering to one another about what they were witnessing. Some passengers walking by stopped to watch, curious about the scene unfolding in the parking lot. A few began recording on their phones, capturing the moment as Maria, a woman of grace and composure, stood her ground against what seemed like an unnecessary and unjust search. "Officers," Maria said firmly, keeping her tone polite but clear, "I've told you. There's been a misunderstanding. My husband is Commissioner James Johnson. If you have any concerns, you can speak with him directly. He's on his way." Taylor turned to her, a faint smirk on his face. "Commissioner's wife, huh?" he said, his tone dripping with skepticism. "Well, we've heard that line before. Nice try." Maria's patience was wearing thin, but she kept her expression calm. She glanced at the growing crowd and could see the concern on some faces. People were beginning to recognize her, whispering her name. Still, the officers showed no sign of stopping their search. As the search dragged on, another police vehicle arrived. Out stepped Sergeant Miller, a senior officer who had been called to assist. He walked over to the scene, his expression serious but neutral. "What's going on here?" Miller asked, addressing Taylor and Grant. Taylor straightened up, eager to explain. "We got a report about this vehicle matching the description of one linked to an incident. We're just checking it out." Miller looked at Maria, then back at Taylor. "And who is this?" "She claims to be the commissioner's wife," Taylor said dismissively, as though it were a joke. Miller raised an eyebrow and turned to Maria. "Is that true, Mom?" Maria met his gaze, her tone steady. "Yes, it's true. I'm Maria Johnson, and my husband is Commissioner James Johnson. He's on his way." Miller's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face, but he didn't stop the search. Instead, he nodded to Taylor and Grant, signaling them to continue. The scene was growing more chaotic. The officers' actions, combined with the murmurs of the crowd, created an air of tension. Maria remained calm but firm, refusing to be intimidated. She knew her husband would arrive soon, and when he did, the situation would take a dramatic turn. One of the onlookers, a middle-aged woman with a kind face, stepped forward. "Why are you treating her like this?" she asked, her voice loud enough to be heard. "She hasn't done anything wrong." Taylor shot the woman a sharp look. "Ma'am, this doesn't concern you. Please step back." But the woman didn't move. "I've been standing here watching, and all I see is a decent woman being treated unfairly. If she says her husband is the commissioner, maybe you should listen." The crowd murmured in agreement, their phones still recording. The officers seemed uneasy but continued their work, determined to prove their authority. Minutes later, the sound of an approaching car cut through the tension. A sleek black sedan pulled into the parking lot, and out stepped Commissioner James Johnson. Dressed in a sharp suit, his presence was commanding. The murmurs of the crowd quieted as all eyes turned to him. James walked briskly toward Maria, his face a mix of concern and controlled anger. He reached her side, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Are you all right?" he asked softly. "I'm fine," Maria replied, her voice steady. "But this has gone too far." James turned to the officers, his tone calm but authoritative. "Who's in charge here?" Miller stepped forward, visibly nervous. "I am, sir. And can you explain to me why my wife is being subjected to this?" James asked, his voice firm. Miller stammered, glancing at Taylor and Grant. "We were following up on a report, sir. The vehicle matched a description." James cut him off. "Did you verify the report? Did you have probable cause? Or did you assume you could act without justification?" The officers stood in silence, the weight of James's words sinking in. The crowd watched, the tension in the air palpable. Maria stood tall beside her husband, knowing that justice was finally at hand. And for the officers, the realization was beginning to dawn. They had made a grave mistake. The air in the parking lot felt heavy as Commissioner James Johnson stood in front of the officers, his sharp gaze fixed on Sergeant Miller. The murmurs of the crowd had turned into hushed silence. All eyes were on James, who radiated authority, his calm yet commanding presence making the officers visibly uncomfortable. James glanced at the two junior officers, Taylor and Grant, then turned back to Miller. His voice was steady, but his tone carried weight. "Let's start again. What exactly led to this situation?" Miller shifted nervously, looking for the right words. "Sir, we'd received a report about a vehicle matching this description. It was linked to a potential incident earlier today. We were just following up." James raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "Following up? By conducting an unwarranted search on my wife's car, without verifying the report first." Miller stammered. "The description matched, Commissioner, and we—" "Enough," James interrupted, his voice cutting through the excuses. "If you had taken 2 minutes to verify the information, you'd have realized this was a mistake. Instead, you chose to escalate the situation and treat my wife, an innocent person, with complete disrespect." Taylor, who had been standing silently, attempted to defend himself. "Sir, we were just doing our job." "Your job," James repeated, turning to face him directly. "Your job is to protect and serve, not to harass and humiliate. Did you even consider how this looked to the public, to the people standing here, watching?" Taylor's face turned red, and he glanced down, unable to meet James's piercing gaze. James addressed the crowd now, his voice strong. "I want to thank all of you for staying calm and documenting what you saw. Accountability is important, and I appreciate your patience as we sort this out." Several people nodded in agreement, some lowering their phones while others continued recording. The atmosphere began to shift, the tension easing slightly as James took control of the situation. Turning back to Miller, James said, "I expect a full report on my desk by the end of the day. This includes the exact chain of events and your justification, or lack thereof, for this search." "Yes, sir," Miller replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "And as for you two," James said, looking directly at Taylor and Grant, "you will report to the precinct immediately. Until we've reviewed this incident, you are both suspended from field duty." Taylor opened his mouth to protest, but quickly closed it when James's stern gaze bore into him. Grant simply nodded, his face pale. As the officers began packing up their things, James turned to Maria, his expression softening. "Are you okay?" he asked. "I'm fine now," she replied, her voice calm but firm. "But this isn't just about me, James. This is about how they think they can treat people, anyone, without consequence." James nodded. "You're right. This isn't just about you. It's about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." The crowd began to disperse as the scene settled, many of them giving Maria encouraging smiles as they left. A middle-aged woman approached her cautiously. "Ma'am, I just wanted to say, you handled yourself with such grace. I'm sorry you had to go through this." Maria smiled warmly. "Thank you. I appreciate that." Back in his office later that day, James began reviewing the body camera footage from the incident. As he watched, his frustration grew. The footage clearly showed the officers' dismissive behavior, their unnecessary escalation, and their failure to follow proper procedure. "This isn't just about today," James said to himself. "This is about a culture that needs to change." By evening, James and Maria sat together in their living room, reflecting on the day. "You stood your ground," James said, pride evident in his voice. "You didn't let them intimidate you." Maria smiled softly. "I had to. Not just for me, but for everyone who's ever been treated like that. James nodded. And now it's my turn to make sure this never happens again. Tomorrow, I'm calling for a full review of how these officers are trained and supervised. Maria placed her hand over his. Together, we'll make a difference. The day had been difficult, but as they sat together, they knew this was just the beginning of something bigger, a chance to create lasting change. The next morning, Commissioner James Johnson wasted no time. He had spent much of the previous evening reviewing the body camera footage and the witness reports. The incident with Maria wasn't an isolated mistake. It was a symptom of deeper issues within the department. Today, he was determined to address it. At the precinct, James called an emergency meeting with his senior officers. The room was tense as they gathered, sensing the gravity of the situation. James stood at the front, his presence commanding attention. Yesterday's incident, he began, was not just a misunderstanding. It was a failure of judgment, of professionalism, and of respect. It reflects poorly on our department and the values we are supposed to uphold. The officers listened intently as James continued, laying out the facts of the case. He detailed how Taylor and Grant had acted without cause, how they dismissed Maria's words, and how they allowed their personal biases to cloud their duty. "This is unacceptable," James said firmly. "And it ends now." James then introduced a plan for immediate action. First, the officers involved in the incident would face a full investigation. Second, the department would implement mandatory training programs focused on professionalism, accountability, and community relations. Finally, he announced the formation of an independent review board to oversee complaints and ensure they were handled fairly and transparently. One of the senior officers, Captain Harris, raised a hand. "Commissioner, I agree this was a serious issue, but isn't this response a bit extreme? It was one incident." James's eyes narrowed. One incident. How many more do you think go unreported? How many people don't have the means or the confidence to speak up when they're mistreated? This isn't about one incident. It's about setting a standard. Harris nodded, realizing the truth in James's words. The other officers murmured their agreement. Meanwhile, Maria had decided to take her own steps to address what happened. She reached out to community leaders and civil rights organizations, sharing her story and encouraging others to come forward if they had faced similar experiences. She wanted to ensure that this moment of accountability didn't fade into the background. Maria also connected with Karen, the middle-aged woman who had spoken up for her during the incident. Together, they began organizing a forum where citizens could share their experiences with law enforcement, both positive and negative. "This isn't about blaming anyone," Maria said during a planning meeting. "It's about creating a space for dialogue. If we want change, we need to listen to each other." Back at the precinct, James's reforms were met with mixed reactions. Some officers embraced the changes, recognizing the need for growth. Others were resistant, feeling unfairly targeted by the new policies. James anticipated this resistance and addressed it head-on. "I know change is difficult," he said during a briefing. "But as officers, we have a duty to serve and protect every member of our community with respect and fairness. If you can't commit to that, then this department isn't the place for you." His words were met with silence, but the message was clear. As the week went on, the impact of James and Maria's efforts began to show. The community forum was announced, drawing widespread interest. Citizens appreciated the opportunity to share their thoughts and feel heard. Meanwhile, at the precinct, the new training programs began, focusing on empathy, communication, and de-escalation techniques. Karen, the woman from the parking lot, attended one of the sessions as a guest speaker. She shared her perspective as a bystander, emphasizing how the officers' actions had eroded trust. "When I saw how they treated Maria, I wondered how many others had been through the same thing," Karen said. "We need to do better, not just for the people we serve, but for ourselves." That evening, James and Maria sat together at home, reflecting on the progress they were making. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't immediate, but they both felt a sense of purpose. "We've started something important," Maria said, her voice thoughtful. "But we can't stop here." James nodded. "We won't. This is just the beginning." As they looked out over the city lights, they knew the road ahead would be challenging. But together, they were ready to face it, determined to build a future where dignity and respect were not just ideals but realities for everyone. The community forum was set to take place in the largest public hall in the city. The announcement had drawn significant attention, with citizens, local leaders, and even members of the media planning to attend. Maria and Karen worked tirelessly to organize the event, ensuring it would be a platform for real dialogue. Maria stood at the entrance of the hall, greeting attendees as they arrived. She was nervous but determined. This was her chance to turn her personal experience into a catalyst for change. Karen stood beside her, offering reassurance. Inside, the hall filled quickly. People from all walks of life came: students, families, business owners, and community leaders. Police officers, including some of the senior staff from the precinct, sat quietly in the audience. Commissioner James Johnson sat in the front row, his calm yet authoritative presence grounding Maria. The event began with a speech from Maria. She stood at the podium, her voice steady and clear. "Thank you all for being here," she began. "This forum isn't about pointing fingers. It's about creating a space where we can listen to one another, share our experiences, and work toward a better future." Maria shared her story briefly, highlighting the importance of accountability and respect in law enforcement. She didn't dwell on her personal ordeal, but focused on the broader issues. Her words resonated with the audience, drawing applause. Next, Karen took the stage. She spoke as a concerned citizen, someone who had witnessed the incident and felt compelled to act. "When I saw how Maria was treated, I realized that it could have been anyone," she said. "We all deserve to be treated with dignity, no matter who we are." Karen's speech encouraged others to share their experiences. A line quickly formed at the microphone as people stood up to speak. Some shared stories of positive interactions with law enforcement, while others recounted moments where they felt mistreated or ignored. A young man named Eric described how he was stopped and questioned while walking home late at night. "I wasn't doing anything wrong," he said, "but the way they spoke to me made me feel like I was guilty of something." Another woman, an elderly teacher named Mrs. Lopez, shared a positive experience. "There was a young officer who helped me when my car broke down," she said. "He stayed with me until the tow truck arrived and made sure I was safe. That's the kind of police work we need more of." The forum created a powerful dialogue, with voices from both sides coming together. James took the stage toward the end of the event, addressing the crowd with sincerity. "As commissioner, I take full responsibility for the culture in this department," he said. "We're not perfect, but we're committed to doing better. Listening to all of you tonight has reaffirmed the need for change." He outlined the steps already being taken, including new training programs and the independent review board. His transparency and accountability won over many in the audience. The forum ended with a standing ovation for Maria, Karen, and James. People approached Maria to thank her for her courage and leadership. A young woman, barely out of high school, said, "You've inspired me to speak up for myself. Thank you." Back at home that night, Maria and James reflected on the event. "I wasn't sure how people would respond," Maria admitted, "but seeing everyone come together like that, it was incredible." James nodded. "It was more than incredible. It was progress." Maria smiled. "This is just the beginning, isn't it?" "It is," James agreed. "But tonight, we took a big step forward." As they sat together, they knew that change wouldn't happen overnight, but they felt a renewed sense of purpose and hope. They were not just addressing a single incident, they were laying the foundation for a culture of respect, accountability, and trust. And that, they both agreed, was worth every effort. The days following the community forum were filled with a sense of renewed purpose. The forum had sparked a citywide conversation about respect, accountability, and the role of law enforcement. Maria and James felt both proud and hopeful, but they knew the real work was just beginning. At the precinct, the atmosphere had started to shift. The officers, who had once been resistant to the changes, were beginning to understand the importance of the reforms. James ensured that the new training programs were implemented swiftly, focusing on empathy, communication, and de-escalation techniques. The independent review board was set up, and complaints were already being addressed with transparency. Karen Morels, the woman who had stood by Maria during the incident, became a vital part of the new training sessions. Her first-hand account as a bystander reminded officers of the importance of public perception and trust. Karen's story highlighted that every action they took was not just about the individual involved, but about how the community saw them. One day, James called a meeting with all the officers at the precinct. Standing before them, he spoke with both authority and sincerity. "We are here to serve this community," he said. "Every person we encounter deserves respect and fairness. What happened to my wife was unacceptable, but it has shown us where we need to improve. Change isn't easy, but it's necessary. I expect each of you to rise to this challenge." The room was silent, but James could see the determination in many of their faces. They were starting to understand that this wasn't just about following orders. It was about becoming better officers and better people. Meanwhile, Maria continued her work in the community. She and Karen held follow-up forums, inviting citizens to share their thoughts and experiences with law enforcement. These events fostered a sense of collaboration and trust, showing that change was not just happening within the precinct, but throughout the city. At one of the forums, a young boy named Daniel stood up to speak. He was only 12 years old but spoke with wisdom beyond his years. "I used to be scared of the police," Daniel said, his voice steady but soft. "But now I feel like they're listening to us. That makes me feel safe." His words brought tears to Maria's eyes. It was moments like this that reminded her why this work was so important. As weeks turned into months, the changes became more visible. The officers were more approachable, and the community started to rebuild its trust in the police. Complaints of mistreatment decreased significantly, and stories of positive interactions began to surface. One day, while Maria was shopping at the mall, she noticed a group of officers helping an elderly man with his bags. The sight warmed her heart. It was a small act of kindness, but it symbolized the progress that had been made. Back at home, Maria and James often talked about the journey they had been on. One evening, as they sat on the porch, Maria looked at James with a smile. "Do you think we've done enough?" she asked. James shook his head. "No, there's always more to do. But we've made a start, and that's what matters." Maria nodded. "I never thought something so painful could lead to something so meaningful." "That's the power of turning challenges into opportunities," James said. "And you've been at the heart of it." The city's newspapers began running stories about the changes, highlighting Maria's courage and James's leadership. People began to see the Johnsons not just as a couple who had faced adversity, but as catalysts for meaningful reform. One headline read, "From Injustice to Change: How One Family Inspired a City." As the sun set on another day, Maria and James reflected on how far they had come. The incident that had once caused so much pain had become the spark for progress, not just for their city but for their own lives. They had learned the importance of standing up for what was right and the power of working together. Maria took James's hand. "We've made a difference," she said softly. James squeezed her hand gently. "And we'll keep making one." As they sat together, the lights of the city twinkling in the distance, they knew their journey wasn't over. But they were ready to face whatever came next, united in their mission to create a world where respect and dignity were not exceptions but expectations. Months turned into a year since the incident that had changed everything. Maria and James Johnson had become symbols of accountability and reform, not only within their city but beyond. Their story was no longer just about one unjust moment. It was about how individuals could rise above challenges and turn them into opportunities for lasting impact. Maria stood in front of a crowd at the city's annual Community Appreciation Day, an event that had been newly established to celebrate the partnership between citizens and law enforcement. The crowd was filled with families, officers, and local leaders. Karen, now a close friend and ally, stood beside her. Taking a deep breath, Maria began her speech. "A year ago, I found myself in a situation I never expected. It was a moment of frustration and humiliation, but instead of letting it define me, I chose to speak up. And because of that, we're all here today, united for something bigger than ourselves." The crowd erupted into applause, and Maria smiled, feeling the warmth of their support. She continued, "This journey has taught me that change doesn't happen overnight. It takes patience, persistence, and most importantly, partnership. Together, we've created a foundation for trust, respect, and accountability." As Maria stepped down from the stage, James joined her, a proud smile on his face. "You were amazing," he said softly. "Thank you," Maria replied, her eyes filled with gratitude. "But this was never just about me. It was about all of us." James nodded, turning to address the crowd himself. "As your commissioner, I've seen firsthand how much progress we've made. But let me be clear, we're not done. There's still work to be done, and I promise to continue pushing for change every day." The event continued with testimonials from community members and officers. Eric, the young man who had once shared his negative experience, spoke again, this time with a different story. "A few weeks ago, I was stopped by an officer while walking home," Eric said. "But this time, it was different. He greeted me with respect, asked me a few questions, and let me go with a smile. That's the kind of police interaction we need, and I'm thankful to see it happening." His words brought a tear to Maria's eye. It was a small story, but it represented the big changes they had fought for. Later that evening, Maria and James returned home, exhausted but happy. As they sat together in their living room, Maria reflected on how far they had come. "Do you think this will last?" she asked, her voice thoughtful. "It will," James said confidently, "because we've built something real. People see the difference, and they believe in it. And as long as we keep holding ourselves and others accountable, we'll keep moving forward." Maria smiled, leaning back in her chair. "I never imagined something so painful could lead to something so beautiful." "That's the power of resilience," James replied. "You took a moment of injustice and turned it into a movement for good." As the city continued to evolve, Maria and James remained at the heart of the change. They became mentors to others, sharing their story and encouraging individuals to stand up for what was right. Their work inspired other cities to adopt similar reforms, spreading the impact of their efforts far and wide. Their legacy wasn't just about what they had achieved, it was about what they continued to inspire. They had proven that even in the face of adversity, dignity, courage, and unity could create a better world. And as they looked out over the city they loved, its lights shining brightly in the night, Maria and James knew one thing for certain: the best was yet to come. Together, they had not only changed their city, they had left a mark that would endure for generations to come.